What's up everyone, and thank you for stopping by the channel. Today's project is this Poulan trimmer, and the problem is that the previous owner tried fixing it over a year ago, but they couldn't get it started. Let's take a good look at it, find out what's wrong with it, and hopefully we can fix it. In this video, we try and repair this trimmer. However, it may not be the exact repair you need to make to yours. We'll explore other options later in the video. So the things that were replaced were the fuel filter, the spark plug, the primer bulb, and strangely enough, a single fuel line, which happens to be blue. But unfortunately, it still didn't start. I'm kind of surprised they didn't replace the carburetor as well, since that's the most likely reason for a trimmer not to start. The first thing to do is to put some fuel in the tank, prime the fuel system, and then try starting it. That way we can see what it does and doesn't do when trying to start it, and then we'll go from there. So the first problem is that the primer bulb is not filling up with fuel. So that means there's a problem with the carburetor. Let's try starting it anyway and see what happens. And since we know the fuel filter was off the line at some point in the tank, there's a good chance that the screen is clogged inside the carburetor. We're going to need to take it off and inspect it at some point. Before we go any further, I want to make sure that the engine even runs. We're just going to put some fuel into the throat of the carburetor and then try starting it. Well, I didn't really like the way the engine ran the first time, so let's try that again. I expect it to run at least a whole second, if not more. Now that we know that it runs, let's continue with the carburetor inspection. This is a rather unique carb design, and I'm not sure why they went with this carb design, but I'm guessing it's because it's a larger engine than normal at 33 cc's. Once the filter base is loose, disconnect the fuel line, disconnect the throttle cable, and the last fuel line from the tank. We'll then inspect the carburetor after that. Before we go on, I think we need to run a compression test. I know the engine will run, but if it's too worn down, then we'll have a hard time tuning the carburetor. The number we're looking for is something over 50, but the higher the number, the healthier the engine. The initial reading is about 45 psi, which is really low. That doesn't seem right since it ran pretty well in our test run. Let's try doing the test one more time, but let's make sure that the adapter is tight against the spark plug hole. It only uses an O-ring to seal against the head, so sometimes it can leak. And luckily, the second reading is a little higher at about 60 psi. However, this reading is still quite low. I'd like for it to be over 70 psi at least. This shows that the engine is a little worn out, so we have to decide if we're going to continue with the repairs. Now, since this is a trimmer and not a chainsaw, being a little down on power is okay. It's very rare there's a high load on it, so it can still do its job. And as expected, the screen is clogged, so we'll need to clean it and check that the gas can still flow through it. We'll remove as much as we can before using carb cleaner. To check the pumping diaphragm, look at it from the side and check that the two check valve flaps are parallel with the rest of the diaphragm. In this case, it is, so this diaphragm is still good. The next thing to do is to remove the plate over the metering diaphragm and inspect it. The metering diaphragm is still flexible, which is good, but it has a couple of wrinkles in it. The other problem is that if you look at it from the side, it seems to be crooked, which isn't good, so it needs to be replaced. To check the flow through the screen, we'll need to put some fuel or carb cleaner on the screen. Next, press the rocker arm on the other side of the carb and watch to see if it disappears from the screen. Since the fuel didn't disappear, try scraping the screen to remove any varnish and try the same test yet again. So the screen is flowing like it's supposed to now, so we can now reassemble the carburetor using a new metering diaphragm. Metering diaphragms can be bought online for a couple of dollars. When buying one, make sure that the stem in the middle is the same size as the one you're replacing. After the metering diaphragm has been replaced, we can now then replace the top part of the carburetor. Next, reinstall the secondary throttle plate, and once the carburetor is back together, we can then reinstall it back on the engine. I'm not going to replace the fuel lines as they're still flexible, and as long as we're going to use non-ethanol gas in the fuel mix, the line should last for a couple of years. Before replacing the return line, we'll press the primer bulb a couple of times to make sure it's working like it's supposed to. And it looks like it is, so we'll keep going on. Before we replace the air filter and its cover, let's prime the fuel system and then try starting it. Since it died when I squeezed the trigger, we'll need to use a special spline screwdriver to add more fuel to the engine when at idle. The screw we want to turn is the one closer to the engine. We'll start by turning it counterclockwise about a quarter turn. There's also one other problem, which is the line on the trimmer head. It's way too thick and its combined length is over 24 inches. I think there's too much load for it to run properly. I'm going to cut it down to about 17 inches instead. This should make it easier to tune the carburetor as well. Well, it's running just a little bit better, but it's best to adjust the carburetor while trimming the grass. In the future, I'll consider using a much smaller line and see if that helps out, considering how worn out the engine is. I'll continue tuning the carburetor once it cools down again for a cold start. So my question is, what would you do with this trimmer? Would you keep using it till it dies, or would you consider buying a new one? This trimmer still has some life in it, but it won't handle tall grass anymore, just light yard work. I know what I'm going to do with it, but I'm curious about your answer. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate your time. Please feel free to ask any questions, and I hope to see you in my next video.